Good morning, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community. My name's Carl. I'm with Poly by Design and the FICA broadcast. We have a special show today about being educated about what the topics are that are in the California election, and maybe how we vote. Maybe we take a position. Some of the speakers today will take a position, and we are definitely going to point you towards references for information on the ballot. Today's October 24th. We're a week away from Halloween and 10 short days away from Election Day. As of this morning, over 54 million voters have already voted, and that's 40%. That's over 40% of the total turnout for 2016. So 2020 is shaping up to be possibly a breakout year in terms of voter participation. We in the NHPI community want to be a part of that. The first thing that we want to do is get registered to vote. And the next piece is getting educated as to how to cast our vote. And we're going to talk about that. So if you haven't done the research, or you've done some research and you want a little bit more information about it, the highly intelligent, well-educated, and extremely eloquent panel is going to help us today. I'm among those. I'm looking forward to the discussion and the information share that we'll have today. So let me introduce the powerful panel that I am so honored to share this virtual space with. Our educators today, and that's everybody's going to be an educator. From the Bay Area, we have leading our education discussion. So any of the measures that deal with education, everybody's going to weigh in on it, but our resident expert is Manufou Liaiga-Anoa'i. She is a member of the Jefferson School Board, and she's a longtime community advocate in the Bay Area. Thank you, Fo. Welcome. So Manufou, are you coming to us from your campaign?
Sort of, yeah. So sorry, I had to unmute first. I apologize for that, but it's wonderful to be here this morning amongst some fierce modified panelists.
Good to have you. I know that you are extremely busy with your with all that you've going on. You're always doing a million things anyway, but now you got a campaign right in the middle of it. So thank you for joining us this morning, Manufou.
Great to be here.
Next, we have the Corina Penaia, and she is going to lead us in the health discussion. There are a lot of specific measures on the ballot, on the California ballot, that have to do with health, and not only health overall, but health issues that the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community are directly connected to. So good morning, Corina.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. So great to be here and serve as a resource for all of you.
Thank you. Where are you coming to us from this morning?
I'm calling in from LA County.
LA County. So is that LA, or LA County is pretty big?
A lot of people. It's the eastern part of LA, closer to the Pomona area.
Ah, nice. A lot of people that don't know about LA would think that, I don't know, Hesperia or Atascadero is LA. Actually being in LA is different. So welcome, and we look forward to your input on the health discussion, as well as anything else that you want to weigh in.
Thank you.
Next, we have our leader in our housing and economic justice discussion today. We have Travis Wells. Good morning, Travis.
Off the day, everybody. Thank you for having me on today.
So where are you coming to us from this morning, Travis?
This morning, I'm coming in from Sacramento, California, Northern California.
Yeah. That's the wonders of virtual meetings. Travis and I are in the same city. I didn't know that before before the introduction. So welcome, and we are definitely looking forward to the housing and economic justice. Those are things that everybody's concerned about, but especially the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community. Climate justice is, that's a big thing. It was in the topic was in the debates. It was in the vice presidential debates, and there are issues that relate to it on the ballot. And leading that discussion this morning is Ilona Rayan. Good morning, Ilona.
Hi, good morning to you all from, well, good morning to you, and it's afternoon here. I'm here in New York.
Oh, you're in New York. Interesting. Well, thanks for joining. Is the weather changing over in New York? Is it getting cold yet?
Yeah, I mean, it's gray and gloomy. And it's, I'm sure, yeah, it's not, sunny like California.
Oh, Travis and I in Sacramento we're not seeing bright and sunny. We've seen a lot of smoke in California, but welcome and thank you for joining us from a different time zone. To talk about civic participation, we have Tavae Samuelu. Tavae is the executive director of EPIC. And she is, I don't know how Tavae does all the different Zoom meetings. I'm on Zoom meetings and I think I'm on a lot. And then sometimes Tavae will end up being in the meeting that I didn't even know she was going to be in. So we look forward to Tavae speaking to us about civic participation. Good morning, Tavae.
Morning.
Thank you for taking the time.
Happy to do it. Thank you for having me.
Always looking forward to it. And then to talk about civil rights, and really civil rights, there's a direct proposition that deals directly with it, but then civil rights really encompasses a lot of things that we talk about and that are important to us. And leading that discussion this morning is Dr. Fuifuilupe Niumeitolu, and I hope I didn't mess that up. Good morning, doctor. I wonder if doctor's having mute issues. Are you there, doctor?
Sorry about that. Thank you so
That's
much.
okay.
I was just saying, hey, Fukafita Ilava and Maloi Lava Kaina. It's grateful to be here and really humbled to be here with all of you.
It's a great space that we're sharing today. And where are you coming to us from?
I'm actually zooming in from Huichin, which is the original people of this land, the Liaiga-Anoa'i's name, for Oakland, California. So brother, actually you're talking to some Oakland Raiders fans. This is where I'm coming from.
Aha. The gypsy team of the NBA or the NFL. All right. Well, welcome to the panel. We have a lot of things to get to. I think that we are going to, I think the discussion is going to be, we're going to talk about the issue in the community and then talk about which proposition applies to that. And I think that that's going to be the best way to educate people as to what the particular propositions means as related to the issues that we face today as a people. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Manufou first. And if you can talk a little bit about education as it is in its importance to us as a community and as a people, and then maybe relate it or tie it back to things that we will see on the ballot in 13 short days.
I'm really happy that we are able to convene ourselves. I've been a big proponent of saying that as Pacific Islanders, we should be unapologetic about gathering and informing our communities and not waiting for the invitation. So this forum this morning is well received for me, and the opportunity to share my tidbits and my little bit of wisdom from an education perspective is that, one, I'll share that I'm running for re-election. I sat on this seat now for 5 years on the local school board. And I think it's really important to bring that point up because there are different perspectives that we look at when we're looking at initiatives and ballot measures this upcoming election. And I think the vantage point that we need to really highlight is awareness of important initiatives that are on the ballot. And so I would like to come out and be forward that I am supporting yes on Prop 15 and yes on Prop 16. And with Proposition 15, many educators have gotten behind this, and myself as a social justice advocate, an education person, and a person seeking re-election to stay on the board trustee seat here in Daly City for Jefferson Elementary School District. Prop 15 allows us and affords us as local community school districts to receive $12 billion annually I know there's a mix of thinking that we would have to share that across many districts across the state, but the reality is there's $12 billion annually that's at stake. And I think the misinformation is that how this will be allocated. This funding will go directly to our local education, learning circles, learning institutions, and locally we'll be able to allocate that funding, disperse that funding as needed in our school districts. And board seats, board trustees allow for those conversations to happen. And that's why representation matters. It's important that we have voices on our local board districts that are reflective of the views that we believe in and that we support. And as a parent of 6 children and my youngest trying to graduate from school during these very difficult times, I need to make sure that she has adequate funding in her school system. I need to make sure that all of the students that I'm auntie to all of the students that come to me and say, and parents who are frustrated, like, why doesn't my child have this? And many times and too often we keep hearing that the response or the answer or the solution is money. And so we need to make sure that the money that is deserving of for the families and the marginalized communities that we come from and represent is given to us. And that's why we speak to Prop 15. I think the other issue that we need to make sure that we address is that we have to make sure that we show up to vote for Prop 15. We can't just say we support it, but we have to be sure that we vote for Prop 15. In addition to Prop 15, I support Proposition 16, which will repeal 209, which I recall many years ago that took away our opportunities as communities of color to basically level the playing field. We did not create the system inequities that we're facing now. Many times people are saying, why don't you speak to merit? I absolutely speak to merit. And I use my son many times who was recruited and was a student and a graduate of UC Berkeley. The reality is that he got in on his own merit. He didn't get in just as an athlete. That was a bonus. You know, he got in on his own merit. But the reality is that we as communities of color are not recruited fairly. And as women of color and being a commissioner on the status of women here in San Mateo County for 10 years, we got to identify the issues with gender gap, and women continue to fight and struggle to be equal to our male counterparts. And that's what Prop 16 does for us. It ensures that we have, we address equity and inclusion from a woman of color, from a parent of children of color. And those are some of the tidbits as to why I support 2 propositions that are aligned with the seat that I represent and the views that I believe in.
Thank you, Manufou. And I think those are things that are important to us. I think 16 is actually a amendment to the California Constitution for something that was pushed through at a different political time in our state. It was much more conservative when 209 had gone through. So kind of catching up with the times. Some of the opponents of 15 would say that, you know, if Kroger's or Safeways or Walmart's their property taxes go up, that the prices will go up in the community or in their stores. Do you think the net benefit with our education is worth that if that happens, that the benefit that the kids will see and the schools will experience is worth that, if indeed that does happen?
Absolutely, absolutely, because education is an equalizer. Education is an equalizer, and education allows us to elevate our families, elevate our communities, and of course allows us to have a stronger economy, because it allows our students who may not have ever thought of education as an option to further themselves. And then again, that's aligned with Prop 16 to ensure that equity and access and inclusion is aligned with our education pathway. So absolutely, I believe that, yes, we're gonna see the transition be uncomfortable, but anything worth it is definitely gonna be uncomfortable. Change comes with discomfort, but it's the change that we're needing right now. That funding is absolutely needed. We're 39th in the country. And yet we provide most of our agricultural food needs, and we are 39th in the country as far as our education system. That is unacceptable, absolutely unacceptable.
As always, extremely well put, eloquent, and I'm always saying Manufou for 24. You should run for president, Manufou. All right, thank you. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to the discussion on health. And health, I think that we found out through the coronavirus that pre-existing health conditions is something that our community needs to address. It's one of the reasons why the virus hit us so hard is because of some of our pre-existing conditions that we find throughout our community. So the health, anything that has to do with health, especially that we're going to vote on, we need to get educated to. So I'm going to turn it over to Corina Penaia to lead us through that discussion.
Thank you, Carl. Really happy to be here today. So currently, I think we're in a much better place to not only evaluate, but also understand the health status of NHPIs. And so I think many people on this panel who are watching, our viewers, can really attest to this, that our community continues to battle with health challenges such as access to health insurance and good quality care, raising families in healthy environments and providing the right housing, and also just making sure that we're able to provide healthy food options and opportunities to ensure that the next generation is prepared to live a comfortable and successful life. Just thinking about the historical trauma, poverty, and marginalization in today's society, those are some of the principal determinants of these health disparities that we continue to see, and they should also be prioritized. Unfortunately, we see that NHPIs have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, and some of these impacts can be attributed to health and socioeconomic inequities that continue to exist prior to the pandemic, but have received very little attention until we started to learn more about how we were being hit. And the emergence of this disparity is not a surprise, given that NHPIs also have devastating rates of chronic health conditions and challenges that keep us from attaining a healthy lifestyle. So with this upcoming election, our families and loved ones and our rights are really determined by how we are voting on some of these propositions. So in regards to health-related propositions, there's Prop 14, which is going to ask voters to help authorize bonds or loans continuing stem cell research. So what Prop 14 would do is decide the fate of California's multi-billion dollar stem cell research program. And it's basically asking voters to spend nearly $8 billion to continue this program, which is taken authority by the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, and to hopefully expand its research capacity. It's tough because during a period when the research environment has significantly evolved, coronavirus has kind of just popped in there and made things a lot more difficult. In terms of the impact of NHPI population, for example, we know that NHPIs have a higher risk of cognitive issues. So thinking about memory loss or attention span and activities of daily living impairments. Through stem cell research, this measure could possibly fund treatments for cognitive problems like dementia and Alzheimer's. But in closing, I think that given the current and/or future political climate, there's a lot of possibility of reversing all of the progress and advancements that have been made through stem cell research. And voters should really consider what California's previous investment in stem cell research has accomplished. One thing I want to note is just, given my experience working with community and thinking about the different entities that we partner with and collaborate with, we always want to hold whoever we're working with accountable for their actions. So making sure that whoever is at the table is representative of the communities that we're serving, and ensuring that NHPIs, if involved, that we're seated at the table and we have a process that we can help to decide what some of those decisions will be. The second prop that folks will see on this upcoming elections ballot is Prop 23. And this is a little tricky one. It establishes state requirements for kidney dialysis clinics to require on-site medical professionals. And so what Prop 23 would do is require these clinics to have at least one physician present during all operating hours and to report infection data to the state. It would also require that operators get approval from the state's health department before closing a clinic and prohibiting them from discriminating against all patients, regardless of their insurance type. And so hopefully this measure would provide an opportunity to improve the health of dialysis patients. In terms of the impact that this measure would have on NHPIs, we do know that NHPIs need access to dialysis services, and we see that throughout a ton of our communities and our families who continue to experience kidney failure. And this is a critical health problem among NHPIs in comparison to all of the other racial and ethnic groups. One thing I want to note is that these issues do tend to drive up costs for patients and families and can be really prohibitive for those with limited incomes and unfortunately lead to significant delays with receiving medical care. So while it's still unclear how this measure will improve our access to dialysis services, I'm really hopeful that it'll hopefully improve like the safety of those patients who are receiving this type of care.
Thank you, Corina. On Prop 23, some of the opponents have said that it would raise the cost of dialysis if you put a physician, an MD at every clinic. It may even close some. Is the balance, if we achieve a safer clinic for the patients, is the balance worth it? Or how do you feel about the opposition that says that this would raise the cost for the person, for the patient?
Right, and I think that's why it's important to take a look at each of the individual clinics that are spread throughout California to get an understanding of what their processes are, what type of challenges they're having, and then kind of pick a strategic plan from there rather than placing an entire plan of regulations that they think fits like a one size fit all might not be the best way to move forward. Because like you mentioned, adding a physician to each of these sites would not only increase costs, but it could take away jobs from some of the nurses and medical assistants who are there. It could also create more barriers to folks like the NHPI community who already have difficulties accessing some of these cares, being in places where medical physicians, they are not as representative for our groups, so we don't see as many of them. And that may be another challenge to getting our folks into these places where we need to make sure that we're serving them to achieve a good quality healthcare. Awesome,
Corina. Really quick, I'm going to ask people, if you are watching this on the live on Facebook, please share this out, especially to your Pacific Islander friends and your friend list and your connections. This is extremely valuable information that needs to be shared, and our people need to get this kind of information from people like Corina. Thank you so much. I think you answered some of the, both sides of the question. So we appreciate your time. We'll probably come back to you as we get through this because there's other health related issues. Thank you. Next up, we have to talk about housing and economic justice. We have Travis Wells, and I think that a community, Pacific Islander community that sits on the edge of poverty as much as our community does. I think housing is one of the key determinants in an election of what we need to vote for and what we need to understand and what we need to be educated with at the polls. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Travis.
Yeah, Sidzu everybody for taking the time to be with us today. I just wanted to start this conversation, or to continue this conversation, and reminding us that it's really important, especially now more than ever, that we as a collective, as a society, view these issues, whether it's housing, whether it's economic justice, whether it's climate justice, education, civil rights, that we view these as deeply interconnected and dependent and relational upon each other. Speaking directly to housing and economic justice, just some quick kind of like statistics out here. The United States is one of the wealthiest nations on the planet, and California as a state by itself, it ranks in one of the top 10 economies of the world, right? And so that's a lot of, we live in a very wealthy area. We live in a very well-off society, but that's a reality that isn't necessarily felt by everybody that lives in California, that lives in the United States. And it's a reality that definitely doesn't connect with the majority of racialized people, communities of color living in California, particularly Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. The issues of housing and economic justice, it's important also to remember that they impact everyone directly and indirectly, especially Pacific Islanders. California as a state is the largest host of Pacific Islander communities outside of our home islands. In the state of California, I believe it's nearly 2/3 of every resident, or nearly 2/3 of all residents are renters, and so they're not homeowners. That number is actually more for Pacific Islanders. The majority of our community members rent spaces, rent dwellings, rent homes, or live in multi-dwelling homes. And so issues around rising cost of living, which includes rising rent prices, skyrocketing rent prices in California, the lack of available or affordable housing for low income residents in the state. Those are issues that directly impact us as individuals, or indirectly impact us as individuals by directly impacting fellow community members, fellow family members, neighbors, and friends. California, because it's the 10th largest state, or the 10th largest economy, or within the 10 largest economies in the world, has developed a lot of industries that are, especially now, under stress, particularly around the COVID-19 global pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really like highlighted what we can see is like the fragility of our current like senses of security when it comes to job security, when it comes to housing. The majority of like industries that Pacific Islander or Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander folks usually maintain are near minimum wage or minimum wage jobs, service industries and restaurants, in healthcare, in agriculture, or in like customer service. And especially with the COVID-19 pandemic changing the way that we have to organize, or we have to gather as in community, these are the jobs that provide pretty minimal security as it is, but then when you add a global pandemic onto the risk, or on top of that as an extra layer, it increases more tension and more challenges to being able to sustain yourself. A lot of the industries that were hit hardest by the pandemic were restaurants, were service industry jobs. The workers that worked in those businesses were either let go or were reduced hours, and that directly impacts folks' livelihood and how they're able to pay rent in a state that is only like raising rent prices across our counties. And I think lastly, what's important to kind of recognize and kind of talk about more is that, especially under COVID-19, it really, this pandemic has really highlighted and exposed a lot of the underdeveloped infrastructure in terms of support, institutional support for our communities. During the last 3 months of COVID-19, the United States' most wealthiest companies gained an additional $1 trillion of wealth during this pandemic. And that's money that was gained while the majority of working class people, the majority of everyday folk were struggling to pay rent, were having their wages cut in terms of time, or just completely in terms of losing job and losing employment. California as a state has implemented some housing protection policies that sort of like put bandages on the bleeding, but don't necessarily don't necessarily address the more systemic issues of housing insecurity, of rising rent and lack of rent control throughout the state, and really only prolong the inevitable increase in economic gap and wealth gap between communities of color, between Pacific Islander communities, and other wealthier groups in the country. So it's really important as we think about these issues to think about how they're connected, how they directly relate to us and our families as Pacific Islander people. On the 2020 ballot, there are a few propositions that directly relate to economic and housing injustice or justice. The first is Proposition 16, which, as kind of mentioned before, addresses equal opportunity, especially when trying to reverse the system of oppression that has kept a lot of people of color from getting higher paying jobs or jobs that could directly benefit their family or their community. The second proposition would be Proposition 21, which is a rent control proposition, which allows local governments in our communities to have more control over implementing and enforcing rent control policies across the state. The third proposition is Proposition 22, which is it's the gig workers classification, which is a proposition that is being pushed by corporations like Uber and Lyft, which have made billions of dollars on this global pandemic at the expense of many of their workers, and is a proposition that is directly challenging workers' rights in terms of being able to classify themselves as employees rather than independent contractors, and then puts a ban or it effectively kills collectivizing, unionizing in this industry, and then allows for or it sets the tone for other bigger corporations to buy their own laws to restrict workers and everyday folks' ability to support themselves and their family. So, yeah.
Thank you, Travis. I think that the gig workers, particularly, that's something that we need to address because it's new, right? Doesn't it always fit under current traditional employment laws, and society and government are going to have to figure out how to deal with those in particular, because you have other gig industries out there as well. So much appreciated, Travis. We're going to move on to climate justice. And I think that we've all heard in the presidential and the vice presidential debates, there's been a lot of discussion about climate change, how we're going to address it, the new Green Deal, all verbiage that we may hear but not fully understand. So we have with us Ilona Rayan to walk us through that and how that applies to the ballots here in California. Ilona, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me, letting me speak in this space. I just, want to make sure everyone knows I'm not from California. I'm out here, in New York. But I think what I am speaking to, the information and the background that I'm giving you will help you make, those decisions when you go to the ballot box. I think really important. I just want to thank Travis for acknowledging how all these issues are related. Climate change ultimately is a quality of life issue. And you can't think about climate change without thinking about justice. We're in this position that we are now. We're in this current predicament because of how we have built our society, right? And so I think, especially now in this time of this pandemic where everyone's talking about going back to normal, normal is what got us here in the first place. So we can't go back to that. And when we talk about building back our economy, it's not building it back to what it was before, it's building it back better. It's building it just and inclusive and green and sustainable. this pandemic has really highlighted all the inequalities that exist in our, in our society. And I think for those of us here in the US, when we think about this election and the first presidential debate, which I'm sure some of us just want to forget, a lot of people were talking about how, climate change wasn't on the agenda, on the things, on the topics to debate. Well, actually it was. So let's take a look at things like the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg, she was among her many legacies was support for environmental policies. So we have to look at who is going to be nominated or coming in to fill her position. What her policies, what she thinks about climate change, if she has any. And if you're following the nomination process, she didn't really have any views on climate change. Second, we have to look at COVID-19. Like I said, this really highlighted the inequalities in our society, and who was affected most, the low-income communities of color, Black, Indigenous, Pacific Islander communities, right? And how is this related to the environment? Well, I mean, there is a link between human society encroaching more and more into the natural world. And really, really important to think about this, even when you're just talking about climate change. And I think a lot of us, even those of us who live in urban areas and cities, it's really important to remember that we are not separate from nature, we're part of it. So what we do to nature, how we pollute it, how we harm it, that comes back to us. We cannot survive without a healthy, sustainable ecosystem. When we look at the economy, we've been, 6 months of lockdown, still, really no end in sight to this pandemic. And, they're talking about building back better. We have to, call for a plan that prioritizes sustainability and environmental justice, investing in green jobs, making sure we have better public services, mass transit that is really connected, and retraining programs for workers who were working in like the fossil fuel industry. And as we start to see things like coal die out, well, how are we going to retrain those people for the new jobs of the future? Race and violence. You cannot talk about climate justice and climate change without talking about racism and systemic racism, because that is one of the reasons we are in this position. You cannot pollute a community if at some point you see that community and that place as expendable, and the people that live there as expendable, right? So, the air pollution and the toxic chemicals and, the tainted water, all those environmental impacts fall heavily along racial and economic lines. And low-income Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, Pacific Islander communities face greater harms than our more affluent white counterparts. And election integrity. We are, minority communities are also the ones that, have been historically, been the targets of voter suppression. And surprise, we're also the people who are on the front lines of the impacts of climate change and environmental injustice. So all these things are really intertwined. And again, it's when you vote for all these issues, ultimately you're voting for, quality of life and climate justice. I also just want to talk a bit about, my background of how I came to be in this space and kind of the things that I see that are interconnected. I started out working for 5 years with the permanent mission of Fiji to the United Nations. I had this great opportunity as a Pacific Islander to work with a Pacific Islander country that was really starting to lead on, climate change issues and sustainability on the global level. And for the past few years now, I've been working with C40 cities, and we are a network of the 96 of the world's largest cities, a quarter of the world's GDP. In the next, by 2050, 2/3 of the world's population is going to be living in urban areas. Our cities are at the front lines of climate change, right? And what I've noticed from my time at the Fiji mission, working on climate change at the global issue and seeing how our, Pacific Island homelands were on the front lines, now working with urban issues at the, climate change at the city level, I'm seeing like our Pacific communities are also on the front lines. So whether our home islands are on the front lines of climate change, our Pacific communities here in the US are also on the front lines of climate change. So please keep that in the back of your mind when you go to the polls, that ultimately you're voting for climate justice. And, I don't want to sound corny, but greenhouse gases and pollution don't respect boundaries. So what happens here in the United States is eventually going to impact our home islands and our Moana and our Pacifica homelands. We do a lot of work. We have, I said 96 cities. I work on a team that manages our North American cities, 3 Canadian cities, and about 15 US cities. And we have LA and San Francisco on there. And the cities come to our network because they see certain issues that are impacting their city. Like, for example, out in California, we're talking about air quality and, mass transit and transportation. Those are justice issues. I think it's unjust to breathe dirty air. It is your human right to be able to breathe clean air and drink clean water. And our workers shouldn't have to be sitting in traffic for hours just to get to a job that isn't necessarily paying them a living wage. We have the same issue out here in New York, where our frontlines workers and I think we should start calling them the maintainers of our cities, our bus drivers, our train conductors, our people who work in sanitation. These are the people who make sure that our societies and our cities are maintained and run 24 hours so we can live the life that we live. And we need to respect them more, and they shouldn't have to be worrying about their safety. We shouldn't be sitting, having to take like a bus, 2 trains, and like 2 hours later go back to your job. This is what it's about. When you vote for climate policies, you vote for, a just, fair, and quality of life. I'll leave it there. I don't want to go on too much or feel like, I'm just blabbing on, but important to keep those things in mind when you go to the ballot box.
Thank you so much. I think hearing those things and understanding how important it is and how global the issue is, but then how specific it affects our community is important information for everybody to hear. So thank you so much for sharing that with us and educating us on that topic. Up next, we have civic participation, and I really think this is why we're here today, is to help people become confident in voting, getting people, I call it, off the sidelines and into the game, and that's civic participation. And that's Tavae Samuelu. She's going to lead us through that. Tavae, it's all yours.
Thanks, Carl. I'm really letting a lot of the gems that Ilona shared just sink in. I also really want to acknowledge the elders or yelders on the panel who really built this space and laid the foundation for it. I'm really clear about everything that I'm able to do at EPIC and in this current position, and all of the ways I'm able to exercise my leadership are because of what you all did before I came along, right? Before I was even a thought. And especially feeling very full circle with Auntie Fui, or let me put some extra respect on it, Dr. Niumeitolu, who's been educating me since I was an undergrad, and is so a huge part of my understanding of what it means to be pro-Indigenous and what's possible in a matriarchy, and just, a model of servant leadership. So thank you. So I'm going to jump into civic participation. And thinking about civic participation, I think it's important to go through and debunk some of the myths that exist about civic participation for the Pacific Islander community. One, there's this notion that Pacific Islanders are not civically engaged, right? With no context around how inaccessible voting is. And also thinking about, was a recent 2018 data survey done by NHPI data that showed that Pacific Islanders are actually far more likely to participate in public hearings. So you think about the ways that our people show up and how it maps onto our cultural practices, right? That a public hearing, that a school board meeting looks like a funnel. These spaces and places where people decide to exercise their power. Then there's this myth number 2, right? This notion that Pacific Islanders are all conservative. You know, I think what's important to think about and know and say really loudly is that notions of conservative or progressive or all of these things are outside of the context of our cultural and indigenous practices. That the same AAPI data survey showed that we actually skew progressive, that 65% of our folks support Black Lives Matter, that they support DACA, that they support like pathways to citizenship. And so want to really disrupt this idea that we're all conservative, right? Because when you think about the values that really drive our participation, that are at the center of how we care for our communities, they are largely about how we honor our elders, how we think about the future, how the children of our communities are part of sustaining our culture. And then there's this third piece, right? This idea that Pacific Islander votes, because we're so small as a community, don't matter. Now, when we talk about civic participation, when we talk about voting, there's a distinction between power and responsibility, that a Pacifica lens understands that we talk about collective power and individual responsibility. That if you know your role in the canoe, your role in the village, you would never think that your responsibility didn't matter. That you would understand very, very deeply that you have to show up and play your role. That when we ask people to vote, when we encourage them to civically participate, it's about playing your role in the canoe, in the village, so we can get where we need to get as a community. That it's about collecting all of the power that we can. So I say all of this to speak to you specifically about Proposition 17 and Proposition 18. Now, Proposition 17 started as ACA 6. It was introduced by Assembly Member Kevin McCarty. And Proposition 17, what it would do is restore the rights to vote for over 50,000 parolees in the state of California. Now, what does that mean for Pacific Islanders as a community? There isn't any NHPI specific data. Unfortunately, when it comes to those types of data that are collected by CDCR or the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, we are aggregated as other. What we do know though, as we talk about the carceral system, and I say this with the positionality and caveat of 1, I believe in abolition, 2, that I have much of my understanding and knowledge and stance comes from and is shaped by abolitionists like Angela Davis, like Ruthie Wilson, like Miriam Makaba, right? That these are the folks that I want you to quote and cite and turn to when we talk about these things. And also to think about how long the carceral system and state has been used to divest our people from our land and our power. That the carceral system is a colonial tool, that many Native Hawaiians will point to, and you'll see a direct correlation between the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy and the increase in incarceration of Native Hawaiian peoples, right? That if you jail them and you take away their right to vote, it becomes easier to take their land. So I say this, right? And I say this to say that when we understand that, we also understand why it's important, incredibly important, to support Prop 17 as we understand that it allows people to vote, that it expands voter access. Next, we have Proposition 18. Proposition 18 is a little tricky in the language, so I want to be really clear. It would allow 17-year-olds who are going to turn 18 by the time the general election comes around to vote, right? So not all 17-year-olds will be able to vote, but some would be able to participate. This is particularly important for the Pacific Islander community because we're a relatively young population. That as of 2017, we're 31% were under the age of 18, whereas the white population, that's 18%. So we have a good portion of folks that are under the age of 18. We also want to think about, for me personally, and as EPIC as an organization, I've really thought about the ways that leadership development, that investing in young people is the importance, it is the future of our communities, right? The future and current present of our communities. And to, you know, cite Huey P. Newton, who stated that the revolution is in the hands of the youth. So I'm looking at young people to guide that. Now, what civic participation looks like for Pacific Islanders right now. So let's start big picture. There are 361,000 Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders in the state of California, according to 2017 estimates. There were roughly 15,000 mail-in ballots that were sent out to Pacific Islander voters. Of that 15,000, only 23% have voted so far. So today is National Vote Early Day. We want to encourage people, because the safest way to vote right now is early. Because, you know, as Corina had noted, right, that we have been as a community devastated by the pandemic, that we want you to exercise your right to vote. We want you to access power in that way. And we also want you to be safe about it, that there's a lot at stake right now. The other thing to note is that of the lowest voter participation percentage right now for our communities is actually the ages 18 to 34. That's me. And I already know I have my ballot waiting and ready to go. So if you have an 18 to 34-year-old in your life, text them, hit them up, please tell them that they need to go vote. So these are all the things, and if you're wondering how to vote, if you're not sure, I do want to humbly offer up, there is a California NHPI voter guide that we were part of creating with a coalition of other Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander folks. Manufou was part of that process as well. And we have recommendations and suggestions based on what it looks like to vote in centering the Pacific Islander community. Things that we've considered that deeply affect and impact us. So I want to offer that up. It's available in Chamorro, Native Hawaiian, Marshallese, Samoan, and Tongan. There's also audio drops that are going to be coming out with how to make a voter plan in multiple languages. So we're here as a resource. And we also recognize that voting and voting rights and voting access varies across states, right? And so if you are not sure what's needed, please check out votingrightslab.org. It's an amazing resource that's divided by state that'll tell you when are the deadlines, when are the request deadlines, what do you need in order to show up. So there are two ways to vote. You can vote by mail or you can vote in person. If you have not registered yet, that's okay. California is a same-day voter registration state. So you can still go to the polls on November 3rd and register to vote there and cast your ballot. So thank you.
Wow. I'm going to give you the nickname Tavae Google Samuelu. If you want information, you go to Tavae. I have a big list as the moderator today to make sure that we hit certain things. Tavae is doing my job as the moderator. I just marked off like the remaining 4 that I had. So thank you so much. And I think you make a great point about incarceration, disenfranchisement of the parolees, people that are not in jail any longer. And I think there's something to be said that America has 2.5 million people in prison. It's the highest prison population in the world. And we imprison people of color at 7 times the rate that South Africa imprisoned blacks during apartheid. So at the height of apartheid, we're 700% higher in the imprisonment of people of color, and pieces of the vote, that's voter suppression. There's so much that you said that needs to be heard by everybody. Thank you so much. And thank you for doing my job too. All I got to do is just turn it over to our cleanup hitter to talk to us about civil rights. And civil rights really encompasses a lot of what, a piece of health, a piece of climate justice, a piece of civic participation. Civil rights is all encompassing in things that are important to our people. So hitting cleanup today, we have Dr. Niumeitolu, and I will turn it over to her. Thank you so much, Doctor, for agreeing to go last. I think there was a rush to the end of the agenda, and we have you to speak for us. So I'll turn it over to you now, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow. Brothers and sisters, I'm really humbled to be here. That's really the truth. I'm really humbled to be here. Niece Tavae, wow, my heart is so full. Honga ia bitogoloto. to see you become the young leader that you are. Wow, I'm so grateful and so humbled. I think about my own self and my development here in California. Tavae and all our young leaders at UC Berkeley, thank you so much for making me who I am today. Also, right here in front of me, I see our sister, our fierce sister, our courageous sister, Commissioner Manufou. Manufou, how can I not honor the great work that you have done here in the Bay Area for all of us? You have opened the doors that we can enter. And I just really want to say the great humility, and thank you so much. And to all our young leaders, please forgive me for not being able to thank each and every one of you and your ancestors for the great work and your great contributions to our world. Also to our brother Carl and the great work and contributions. Si, maloi ngau and maloi puki puki whanua, brother Carl. Thank you so much. Thank you for holding up the land and holding our Moana Nui community together. Brothers and sisters, I recognize the time, and I promise, when you have a Tongan say they're going to tell a short story, never believe them. So I'm going to tell a short story. Please don't believe me, okay? But no, I get it. I understand that we're on Western time, everybody. So I just actually, Brother Carl, if we could just post up the little photograph this is from the 2015 Climate Justice March here in Oakland, California. There we go. And I think in many ways, this really speaks what I want to say, because every single warrior and leader has already spoken the truth. Everybody has. Maybe what I can do is just a little humble contribution. This is from our mokopuna. This is a word that many of us in the Pacific derivative of the next 7 generations or grandchildren. As you can see, our young warriors there from the Marshallese community from Sacramento at the 2015 Climate Justice March, they're holding a sign, "We're not drowning, we're fighting for our mokopuna." And that's the work that we do. This is why we're here together in the circle, in the secret circle. Because as every single one of you said, and I just want to reiterate what you just said, Tavae, it is also our ancestral calling. The young warriors talked about, this is our ancestral calling community. Brothers and sisters who are watching, brothers and sisters who feel perhaps like this country that you don't belong. We understand, and we're here with you. We're standing right next to you, fighting. I want to just talk a little bit about these young people. These young people, as you know, like many of us from the Pacific, as our good sister, Sister Rayan spoke about climate justice, right? It's our islands. It is us as Pacific Islanders who are disproportionately our islands that are being drowned out, right? We are also in the populations of climate justice refugees. That's us, that's our people. For us as Pacific peoples, our Moana, which is our ocean, our whanua, our land, our Mother Earth is everything. And so when our Mother Earth is disappearing, that is exactly what you all said. That shows up in the privatization of our people, that shows up in the high numbers of COVID and the invisibilization that our people are dying. And yet, brothers and sisters, with all the high rates of privatization, with all the high rates of COVID, with so many of us with food insecurity, with housing insecurity in this land, look at us, we're standing up and we're fighting. Because that is who we are. And I think that this is just really what I wanted to bring up, I wanted to just, in closing, I know about our time, and I promise I'm not gonna be Tongan, I promise. In closing, I just want to talk a little bit about the prison industrial complex that so many of you have brought up. And for me, why I'm also voting yes on Proposition 16 in agreement with the brothers and sisters on this panel, and also no on Proposition 20. Brothers and sisters, just to tell a really, I promise, fast story. One of the work that I've been really blessed to have done was the work that I did with my sister Laura. We worked with Pacific Islander and American Indian prisoners, mostly male, prisoners in Solano and San Quintin prison, and women prisoners as well on different increments at Chowchilla. You know, brothers and sisters, I want to talk about the importance of higher education and how many of our people have been denied higher education. And also, again, standing with all of you, advocating for the state of California to include Pacific Islander studies and Arab American studies in its curriculum. You know, I think about this one day when we were in a group with Pacific Islander men from in their 70s to men, to young men, young brothers in the age of 21. In the stories that we shared, that they shared in that group, the young man talked about how when they came to America, that the migration to America was a pipeline towards prisons and the prison industrial complex. The young men in our conversations in the groups that we talked about the breaking up of the families. Many of them had mothers, brothers, mothers and aunties who were working the gig jobs, the gig economy, working as live-ins, fathers that were working doing iate, landscaping, nonstop, who when they got ill, when they broke their bones, had no insurance. Young men who found in this world were Pacific Islander, the racialization of our people was equated to criminalization, said that in their first day in junior high school, their first day in high school, they met with a principal who said, young man, we already know who you are. We don't want any trouble from you. And then they met with their counselors. What their counselors did, instead of giving them the opportunities that they gave every other white student, they directed them towards servitude, towards working in manual labor. And they would say, if you graduate, which you probably won't, these are your options. So yes, disproportionately our people. I agree with our brothers and sisters who said that the migration to the United States, because of the systemic racialization and class of this economic class systems that disenfranchise them, that prison industrial system became the norm. On this particular day, and just finishing the story, brothers and sisters, you know, many of the brothers also were really, really depressed. Right, on this particular day, and I thank my sister-in-law for doing this. She said, hey brothers, we brought you something that we want you to read, right? And they were like, read? Okay, what do you want us to read? And we said, hey, we're bringing you a gift from the ancestors. And what was that gift, brothers and sisters? It was the essay, Our Sea of Islands, by one of our forefathers of Pacific Island Studies, our forefather who coined the term for us, Oceania, Dr. Ebeli Haofa. And we said, hey brothers, we're gonna leave this essay with you. We're gonna come back next week and we're gonna discuss it. These guys were depressed at this time before we left. Many of them were hopeless. Many of them did not see themselves in any kind of hopeful future. To cut the story short, when we came back for the group the next week, I have to tell you, when every man came into that circle, they came in tall. When every brother from the 70-year-old to the 21 came and sat in that circle, their head was held up high. And then when we started this discussion, the group, we started with the prayer, and right afterwards, it was the elder who spoke. He said, Nieces, he cried and he spoke in Samoan. And then he said, Nieces, this is Law and me. He said, I have never known who I was. I have never seen myself being represented in any of the public schools that I went to here in California. And he said, what a great, great blessing, what a great miracle it is to see another Pacific Islander brother write about us, about our experiences. For the first time, you saw the twinkle in the eyes of the 21-year-old and the 30-year-olds. The eyes, all of us started to cry. For the first time, even myself. I said, wow, we see ourselves. What Epeli Haofa did and what Pacific Island Studies does it, and what these young warriors are doing, it reminds us of our great mana. It reminds us of our great beauty. It reminds us that we are everything that is good. Our ancestors fought for us, and we're still here, brothers and sisters. We are not drowning, we are fighting for our mokopuna. And in closing, this is who we are. So for those of you, our relatives who are watching on Facebook Live, we ask you, as our young warrior, Tavae, our commissioner, Manufou, our young brother, Travis, Ilona, Corina, our brother, Carl, we're all here, we're inviting you. We're inviting you to this, for us as Pacific people, to this sacred circle. Let's do this for our mokopuna. Let's do this for what our Native American brothers and sisters say for the next 7 generations. Hey, Tuafa, to so much love and respect for all of you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for those heartfelt words. You know, I want to just real quick talk about, Tavae spoke about it, the doctor spoke about it, that our young people are our future. We're the fastest growing, the youngest ethnic minority in the United States. Our young people are our future. In 2008, I have triplets. In 2008, they were 9 years old. I took them to the polls with me to vote. I showed them how important voting was. They vote every year. They'll turn 22 this year. They vote every year. They know how important it is. So I would say to our viewing audience, if you're not in that 18 to 34 group and you've got kids and you want to be a role model for them, show them how important voting is. Be part of the team. If you're 18 to 34 and you're in that picture that we showed of the young people from Northern California, you are our future. We need you to vote. And I would say thank you so much, Doctor. Tavae, Google Samuelu, Ilona, Rayan, Travis Wells, Corina, Penaia, Manufou, Liaiga-Anoa'i, Alisi, Tulua for running the Zoom, sister. Thank you so much. And thank you to Pacifica Vote. A quick shout out, Naki's not here, her son, Mac Mully, aka Mac Mully, it's his 30th birthday today. Another 18 to 34-year-old that is voting because he sees how important it is. Happy birthday, Mac. Thank you, ladies. Thank you, Travis. Everybody have a great rest of their weekend. Love you much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Vote, vote, vote.
I have to hang on until the lag on Facebook Live.
Hey, Carl, I just really wanted to thank you so much for your, really, I mean that. Thank you so much. And
Oh, you're welcome.
Alisi,
These are things that our people